As we get into it, let's talk about the Blackfoot people first. Let's go to this first image here. Now this is Ini, or Iniksi, the buffalo, or the North American bison as we know it. Well, Ini, the buffalo, was our staff of life. Basically, it provided us our food, our clothing, and our shelter. And there was over 400, or actually hundreds anyways, of uses that we had for this animal. So wherever the buffalo roamed, we, the Blackfoot people, followed this animal all over the northern prairies. So if we look at the next image. So if you could see it from this image here, for thousands of years, the Tipi, the Blackfoot speaking peoples, we were nomadic pedestrian hunters. Basically meaning on foot, we roamed all over the northern plains following the buffalo. And so we hunted Ini, and we also fought with enemy tribes with weapons of our own manufacture. So this was for thousands of years, and our ancestors, they traveled all over this land on foot. So they followed the buffalo. I just want to make that clear. That's our sacred relationship the Blackfoot people have with Ini, the buffalo. So because of our constantly wandering through our land, we got to know every square inch, every square mile of this vast land of our territory. And our trails, they were well marked throughout the entire grasslands. The Old North Trail, you may have heard of it, the Blackfoot Trail. These were just two of probably hundreds of trails that crisscrossed all across the prairies that our people followed. Okay, so let's move to this next image. So through most of the year, hunting bands move from one place to another, from one temporary encampment to another encampment. And as we follow the buffalo over the open grasslands, each family was responsible for the movement of its own baggage, or luggage, for lack of better words. And if you look at this contraption, well, before we talk about that, a family's largest and heaviest possession would have been their teepee. And a teepee is basically a conical lodge with a foundation of stout poles over which we cover with a buffalo hide. And the size of the teepee depended a lot on how strong your dogs were, how much they could lift, how much they could drag across the prairies. And strong dogs could lift or drag up to 80 pounds from one place to another. So you can see on this particular image, this is a drawing, but this is of a dog carrying the teepee cover, which would have been a buffalo, made of buffalo skins, sorry. So in the dog days, our teepees were a lot smaller compared to the teepees we see today. So these teepees were maybe 10 or 12 feet high, and they may have had a base of 12 to 10 feet. And stones were used rather than pegs to keep the teepee hide grounded. So these poles that were used to put up a teepee frame were also used to form the wooden sleds we call travois that carried our possessions across the plains. Okay, we have a question out there. Okay, we'll proceed with questions at the end of the webinar. So from here, we'll just proceed to the next slide. So to keep pace with the buffalo herds, we used imitakes, our dogs, imita, dog. We used dogs to pull these wooden sleds we call travois. So on these sleds are everything we needed to survive. Our pemmican, our meat, parfleche bags, other camp utensils, and particularly our teepees to live in. So as I mentioned, the poles used to make the travois were also used for the frame of the teepee. So a strong dog, as I mentioned, could drag a load of 70 to 80 pounds across the prairie. Just wanted to kind of mention the teepee rings. So in Alberta, southern Alberta, Saskatchewan, and in Montana, there are places where there are hundreds of teepee rings. And basically these teepee rings were used to hold down the edges of the teepee. And then as these people moved on from one place to the other, they would have just kind of rolled off the stones and then picked up camp and left. In some cases, you'll find stones around the edge and then stones in the middle, which would indicate a hearth. And these were probably winter camp teepees because they had a fire inside the teepee. And you can tell these things if you look at the teepee stones or the teepee rings, and you might get an idea. So as our teepees got bigger, we started to use pegs and stones to keep the edge of the teepees down. And an indication of this is the teepee rings, as I mentioned, all over southern Alberta. Most of these probably would have been from the dog days because they're not very huge in diameter. They're a lot smaller, as I mentioned, maybe 8 to 12 feet in diameter. And then when the horse came, the teepees got much bigger. But we'll talk about that in a bit. Okay, so we go to the next image there. Well, let's talk about it now. When Punukomita, the horse, or elk dog in our Blackfoot language, as translated into English, well, when Punukomita became our new beast of burden, our teepees became much larger. Now, if you look at the diagram there, you can see the little dog travois, and those were birch poles, and the thicker part were tied up in the top near the dog's shoulders, and the thinner part were on the ground where the basket was, usually made of willow. Well, compare that to the travois being pulled by the horse. Now those are lodgepole pine, and they could carry like 10 times the weight of a dog. And those lodgepole pine became the framework for our teepees. Look at the next picture. This is a Blackfoot Camp. And I just kind of want to make a point is that it was our women, our mothers, our grandmothers, who put up our lodges and were responsible for the teepee. And I always like to say this, but my grandma would say, no woman in her right mind would allow a man to put up the family's home. Basically, you're there to help, but the teepee itself was put up by mom, our grandma, and the aunties, and they did it perfect. Men would just be there for muscle, basically. So if we go on to the next image, we'll talk a little bit about the Blackfoot and our territory. Now, Nitawasi is our name for our land. For our land. And so the Blackfoot were basically the people of the land of the buffalo. So the buffalo basically defined our territory. Wherever the buffalo went, the Blackfoot followed. And we followed them all over the plains, the northern plains. And so our ancient stories tell us that we were given this land, this territory, by Itsabetapiopa. Sorry, let me say that right, this thing's echoing. Itsabetapiopa, our creator and essence of life. So to the Blackfoot, these are sacred, these lands that we were living on. And I just wanted to point out, I was kind of given some insight by one of our Blackfoot knowledge keepers, for lack of better words, or our elders. And as far as painted teepees, I'm thinking what we're going to need to do is bringing some of these elders to speak more regarding the painted teepees, because these were special teepees. And I want to point out one thing. It didn't, how could I put this? Well, actually, let's just go into the next part and I'll kind of explain what I'm talking about. Well, let's kind of look at the Blackfoot Territory and then we'll have a better idea. When you look at this map, our traditional territory extended from the North Saskatchewan River, which is near present-day Edmonton, all the way out to like Prince Albert. The North Saskatchewan River all the way south to the Yellowstone River. And on the map you can see Bozeman, Montana and Billings, Montana. To the west, the Rocky Mountains. And to the east, the Qu'Appelle Valley and the Touchwood Hills, which is actually east of Regina. Well, this vast area covered all of those terrains, mountains, foothills, plains, and then you have hilly country throughout the different parts of our territory, our ancestral territory. Well, our people, they believe that this territory and all the resources in it had been given to us as a gift by Apistadoki, the creator, for our specific use. So other tribes were welcome to visit and to trade, but not to take our game, our resources. So over the centuries, the different bands among our people, they developed the habit of living in different parts of our territory. Now, if you can see this map, the Siksika were usually found along the northern and eastern part of our territory. And the Gaina lived in the central part, while the Piikani camped in the mountains and along the foothills to the west. And I'm not too sure even how you pronounce it, but the small robes, the Noxics, they lived in the mountains and on the west slope, like in the Bitterroot Valley. So our people lived in a vast, huge area. And if we look at the next image, it's basically one of the Tipi, the Blackfoot Confederacy. And those are the present tribes today that make up the Blackfoot Confederacy, or Tipi. And that's the Piikani, Amskapi Piikani, Siksika, and Againa. So these four tribes make up the Blackfoot-speaking peoples today. And I was told by an elder, knowledge keeper, and painted teepee lodge owner that I might have made a mistake last week when I was speaking about teepees and the motifs, the bottom skirt of a teepee. Some of them were pointed, some of them were rounded, and some of them were flat. Well, this does not reflect that because the Piikani lived near the mountains that all Piikani teepees would have had these points. It was pointed out to me by a painted lodge owner that the power that that lodge represents, or where it receives its power, is where it gets its design from. So if it's a Blackfoot teepee, that could have came from the plains, it could have came from the foothills, could have came from a set of hilly hills somewhere, or even in the mountains. but it didn't necessarily mean that you came from one particular tribe, because it was also pointed out to me that our people freely roamed throughout our territory without peacefully. They didn't have to worry about being attacked. So you'd see teepee camps where you'd have all of those motifs within that tribe. But you know, we are going to be getting elders and people, knowledge keepers, to come to speak on this program as we advance over the next few weeks. And we're hoping to get some of these painted teepee lodge owners, or one of them at least, to come out and speak a bit about their teepees, because this is such an important part of our culture that we don't want to misrepresent anything. So that being said, if any of you people out there have questions, or there's something that you feel you could add to this program that's going to make it more informative, please feel free. Send us an email, contact us. Let us know what's going on as far as how you feel about the program, whether we're making sense or if some things aren't making sense. So let's go on to the Blackfoot Tipi itself. So I just want to point out here that our Blackfoot teepees are truly unique. Not just how beautifully they're designed and they're made and how they're kind of similar, the same but not the same. Our Blackfoot teepees, well, at least I feel, and I've been told, that it was our mothers and grandmothers who invented the very idea of the teepee, and over the centuries perfected it. So if you look at the teepee here, the Blackfoot teepees actually use 4 poles, and then they're tied in a certain way. And as from what I understand, there's only 3 or 4 tribes on all of the plains that actually use 4 poles in their teepees. And that's the Blackfoot, the Tsuut'ina people, and the Crow, and possibly the Kiowa. I've heard this. But these are the only 4 tribes. Every other plains tribe of the North American plains uses 3 poles, which is sort of kind of comes from the eastern woodlands part. So the 4 poles come from the prairies, and our people use 4 poles when we put up our teepees. And if you can see the picture there, the diagram, there's a certain way that it was tied. And originally our teepee covers were made from buffalo hides. So depending on the size of the teepee would depend on how many buffalo obviously you would need to make that teepee. So we go to the next image. This is the ground setup, or how you would put the teepee up. There would be 4 poles, as I mentioned, and 2 of those door poles would be facing to the east, because obviously that's where the door is going to be. And Blackfoot teepees, the doors always faced towards the east. And you can see, once the teepee was put up, there was a rope that was leading down, like an anchor, a guy line. And so that helped support and keep the teepee more stable. So like if the heavy winds came up, like which happened on the prairies, our teepees wouldn't go flying away because of the design and how it was built. And as I mentioned, our grandmothers and mothers are the ones who invented this teepee, so they would have figured this out over the years and learned how to perfect them. So as I mentioned, the skin teepee cover was originally made from buffalo hides, sewn together by the ladies in the tribes. And it wouldn't have just been one person. There would have been a lot of older ladies who would be teaching the younger ladies how to put the teepees together. So teepees would have went up actually pretty fast when they all worked on them and stitched them together. And when the buffalo eventually disappeared or almost extirpated, almost went extinct, well, then the Blackfoot started using canvas to make their teepee covers. As you can see here, these are women back then putting up the family teepee, the camp. So what was inside the teepee were teepee liners. Now the teepee liners were just basically some cloth that were hanging on the inside of the lodge all the way around the teepee, from one side of the entrance to the other side of the entrance. But what these acted as was like wind traps. So when the wind blows from the outside of the teepee and goes under, that wind would be carried out by the teepee liners, and if there was a fire in the teepee, that wind would take the smoke out of the teepee through the smoke flaps. And that's ingenious. Whoever figured that out thousands of years ago was a genius. Because that's pretty much the only dwelling I can think of where you can actually put a fire inside the teepee. So even if you have a blizzard or it was minus 40 degrees out, if you were properly set up, you'd be sound as a pound inside that teepee. You'd be warm. You wouldn't have to worry about the winds and the snow and things like this. So these are the teepee liners we spoke of. Let's go to the next image, which is basically kind of the teepee interior basic setup. You'd have central hearth in the middle, and then from the, well actually let's go to the next image. These are different interior basic setups. This is more of a Blackfoot one. From the entrance, right across the entrance, you'd see the owner's sleeping area. There'd be a fire in the middle, perhaps an altar between the fire and the owner, and on each side there'd be sleeping areas for family. And towards the entrance you'd have storage space pretty much, where you could put your fuel, you could put your logs, your wood, your buffalo dung to keep a fuel pile, and you could put storage between the lodge and the teepee liner. So this is the basic interior of a teepee. Now, as I mentioned, if there's teepee owners out there and wish to add anything to this program, please call in, because there are a lot of things that we could discuss, but we're picking certain items because of the duration of the program. So one of the main items inside the teepee was the willow backrests with a tripod. These were like your modern day lazy boys, or your recliners. You can get yourself comfortable if you're going to do some work, or if you're going to do some sewing, or if you're going to be fixing anything, and you could adjust the tripods and the willow backrests to get yourself comfortable, either leaning over or lying back, and they're pretty solid. And you could recline in your favorite position, so to speak. And this is what the willow backrests, one of their uses. The other uses was to divide sleeping areas. So, yeah, well, basically divide sleeping areas. So if we look at some more of these images here, these are just images of some teepee interiors. You see here kind of like what's hanging up inside the teepee, as I mentioned. You'd see where your clothes could be hung, where some of your belongings were. This isn't necessarily how they all were. This is just an idea of how a teepee interior would look. We can look at some of these old photographs here, and we could actually see some of the people's teepee liners and decoration behind them, as far as their beadwork or horse cruppers or things like that. We see here inside the teepee there's a man and his child. We look at the next image, you see some men singing. So this could be a ceremony of sorts in those days. And these are all singers, these men. If we look at this next picture, you see some more people. And notice the different teepee liners. They have different designs. So every house kind of had its own decoration, of course. This is one of our late elders who were very instrumental in this place, Blackfoot Crossing, being here. Teepee interior. So I just wanted to show, let's go to the next image. We have a lot of teepee interior pictures here. Okay. It's like I mentioned earlier. This is a Blackfoot camp, and if you look at the bottom skirt of the teepees, you'll see that they're different. And this would be a normal camp. And in a Blackfoot camp, let's say 200 years ago, there would have been practically hundreds of teepees, and the majority of which would be just plain teepees, no decoration. But those painted lodges all had a story. And the owners of these painted lodges know the story of these lodges. So they would be able to tell you the significance, the meaning of behind some of the symbols in these teepees. Now, I'm not a teepee owner or a ceremonialist, so to speak, so I wouldn't even try to attempt to speak or explain what all of these symbols are on a lot of these painted teepees. But I would recommend, if you know someone who owns a painted teepee, speak to them, ask them, and then you could hear from the horse's mouth, so to speak, what the symbols in that behind that teepee, what they truly mean. So from there, let's go into the next image. So you see here a number of, like, there's white teepees there. You see these would be majority of which, as I spoke, inside a teepee camp in those days. But then there would also be painted lodges. And the painted lodges, the story would be known by the owners, maybe by some people in camp, but the owner of the painted lodge would know the story behind that lodge and what the symbology or what the symbols mean. Because you notice they may follow a certain motif, and that motif tells you where that teepee originated and where it gets its power from, or where the dream or spirit person gave that vision to that person who owns that teepee, or they transferred it with that story. But you notice that not all teepees are the same. Like some medicine lodges, as the blue one with all the white, like right here, that teepee, I don't really know what that means, but that doesn't look like the rest of the ones there. So only the owners of certain medicine lodges would know those stories. I'd like to point that out to you viewers who don't know. And to tell you the truth, not being a painted lodge owner myself, there are a lot of things that I don't know, that I probably wouldn't learn until I decided to transfer or purchase a teepee like that. So we can go to the next image, sorry. Oh, okay, the circle camp. Now, from what I understand, this never happened. This was very rare. It happened very rarely. And usually when all the tribes, all the bands in a tribe came together, then they would form a circle camp, which may have been usually only during the Ogan, but this is when all the tribe gathered together. And there were certain designated places that every family or every clan sort of knew where they were supposed to be camped. So if you're a part of that particular clan, then you would know which side of the circle camp you would camp. And if you were Siksikaikawan, in our circle camps, basically you'd know all the clans or the families. So if you want to learn more about that, send us a letter in and we'll see what we can do to kind of update. I'm just kind of giving you a rough synopsis of what that is. But this is the only time the Blackfoot would camp in a circle. Otherwise, we would set up in a camp and spread out along the riverbank or what such for however we wanted to set up camp. So I just wanted to point out the circle camp. This is a regular, well, basically camp along a riverbank. And like I mentioned before, as was told to me by one of our elders, is that those motifs for teepees, whether it's plains, foothills, or mountains, every different tribe would have a mixture of these different types of teepees. So we can look at the next image here. Another picture of a teepee camp, and I just kind of want to point out, because you look outside and you can see some tripods or travois that are put up, and there's things hanging from them. Well, a lot of these were holy items, whether sacred bundles or if they were medicine pipes. But those medicine people would take these things and they would put them on the outside of the teepee during the day, but they would always bring them in bad weather or at night, because a lot of these were treated almost like children when they were caring for these sacred objects. But that's if you ever wondered why there's a little sort of a tripod or a travois or whatever hanging or outside hanging something. That's usually what the purpose of it. It wasn't a teepee they never finished putting up. So then you'd see workstations around the teepee too. Not so much today, but in the Buffalo days there would have been poles put up for breaking the fibers and skins to make them softer and things like this. So the last thing I guess we'll talk to as far as Blackfoot homes were like Blackfoot war lodges. Now in 1805, when the Lewis and Clark expedition came in through the Missouri, they found a lot of these types of homes up on the high alpine where the wood was, or deep in the river valleys or those thick with cottonwoods. They would find these type of dwellings. And for the longest time they thought these type of homes were what the Blackfoot people were actually living in. But no, these were war lodges. So our people, they would go into enemy country and they would go up high on a mountain where there's a lot of alpine brush and trees, or they would go down into a valley where there's a lot of cottonwood and birch. And basically what they would do is they'd make these teepee-like dwellings, which are about maybe as high as 12 or 15 feet high, and the base itself could have been about 15 feet wide, and they could accommodate literally about 20 people to sleep in them. And they would put a fire pit in there and they would burn willow, because apparently willow doesn't really make a lot of smoke. And this is how they would keep themselves warm. And they would take the cottonwood bark off of the trees and they would put it all along this to camouflage it. Then you see the long part there, that's actually the entranceway. And then the entrance was actually curved. So when you came into it, you'd have to turn to go inside the lodge, which made you vulnerable if you're the enemy, because a person sitting inside the lodge could literally sit there and shoot you if you came into his home. But the Blackfoot would build them this way, because even if they were caught, they could use it as a fortress. You could see at the bottom of this image, there was a lot of logs of wood. So if someone were shooting in the days of the bullets, if you were down on the ground inside of these war lodges, you were safe. You had no problem. You didn't have to worry about getting shot. And in fact, that's how a lot of Blackfoot war parties got away. They would get caught in one of these things, and come nighttime, they would sneak out the back and go down a little coulee and escape back with their horses back to Blackfoot country where they were safe. But I just wanted to bring these up because these are the type of structures that our people literally built in past days. So other than this, talking about some of the dwellings that we used to sleep in, if there's any questions out there, we'll take some of your questions now. We could talk about anything.
When I saw the teepees along the bank, I wondered, are they all open to the east?
Well, that's a good question to actually look at the picture. But if they're Blackfoot, they would be facing the east. Yeah, so this must be somebody taking picture from the north side of this camp. And all of the entrances, from what I can see, are all facing east.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
This one is from Deanne.
Hello, we got a question from Deanne. That's a Blackfoot War Lodge?
Yeah.
Oh, that's so awesome. I would love to see pictures of that.
Yeah, I do have pictures.
perhaps you could send us a pic or something. We just kind of come across these sort of dwellings ourselves not too long ago, and it was very interesting to realize how ingenious our people were when it came to actually scoping out and scouting the enemy and not being caught, and knowing when was the right time to steal horses and such, hard to escape or survive. So that's awesome. I don't know how many other people out there know about the Blackfoot War Lodges, but these were really clever homes, fortresses. Well, thank you for that. If you can, actually, you could probably get our address, Blackfoot Crossing Historical Park website. Sorry, was there another question?
This one is from Facebook. Denise
Okay.
Smith. What changed the height of the teepee? Wouldn't a smaller teepee be the warmer choice?
Oh, well, do they know this question, or should I speak it? Okay, well, we got a question from Facebook, and it was basically about kind of like the warmth of a teepee. In the dog days, the smaller teepees, you would have had your teepee there, and yes, for sure, you'd be pretty warm. But there's a lot of people who've been inside teepees and may have slept inside teepees before. If you have an open fire, even if your teepee's a 20-foot high teepee, 22 feet high, that fire is going to warm up. Depending on how much fuel you throw on it, it'll warm up that entire teepee for the entire night, so long as you keep your eye on the fuel. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think both would be very warm.
One from Facebook. This one says, I would like to know more about the wars or fights the Blackfoots were involved in.
One of the questions there was you want to know a little bit more about the fights and the wars that the Blackfoot were in. Well, other than coming over here or talking to an elder about some of these things, I would recommend that you look for a book called The Blackfoot Winter Counts by Paul Razka. And if you wanted to know about those type of things, you could look from the winter counts from about 1765 all the way up until the turn of the century, 20th century, and it can tell you almost every major battle that's happened between the Blackfoot people and other tribes, and even some stories about some of the warriors. But other than that, you know, to come over and sit down, that'd be a good place to start to look at that kind of information. So any other questions out there from the audience? Okay, we have another question.
We're wondering how teepees could become larger to accommodate growing families.
Okay, the question was, how would teepees get larger to accommodate growing families? Well, to be honest with you, I think you would know when you got to a certain point when you've gotten too many people for that teepee, and then they would build another. Most of the teepees would have been somewhat uniform in size, but that being said, there were differences. Like there are even today 16-foot teepees, and then you have 24-foot teepees, and maybe even 30-foot teepees. It depended on the lodge owner and what he wanted to do. From what I understood, there were some chiefs that when their families got too big, they built two teepees, one for themselves and their wife, immediate family, and the other teepee for other members of extended family. So as far as accommodating teepees, I don't think the size was so much. I think they did reach a limit, maybe 10 people. That would be enough people in a large teepee. But for the most part, when there got to be too many, they would build another teepee. It just makes sense. Okay, well, I hope that kind of answers your question. Is there anybody else out there who's got any questions? Okay. Well, I guess that's all the questions we have for today. For next week, I'm inviting all of you to come back again. We're hoping at this time that we can bring in a teepee lodge owner, and then they could speak for a few minutes to their teepee and the meanings behind those sort of things. But in the meantime, we're going to continue with the Blackfoot Tipi program. And if you have any questions that you may think of between now and next week, feel free to send us a question and we'll do our best to answer it. So with that, I say take care of yourselves, be safe, and we'll see you again. Keda Matsin.